And then around 860 AD, these Viking raiders began settling in Britain, normally starting around sort of the East Midlands, certainly the east coast of Britain. But eventually they took over Northumbria, East Anglia, and parts of Mercia as well, Mercia being sort of the Midlands. And of course, there's a map up here, but just to explain it to you while you're listening, this is representing the kingdom of Guthrum. So this is a specific period in this history. And of course, the borders changed a fair amount. So this is just a general vibe, but depending on which period of history you're talking about, this could change a lot. But this, I think, this period represents where the Danes and the Saxons had influence, I suppose. So you've got sort of the West Midlands being more Anglo-Saxon than the East Midlands. Kent being more Anglo-Saxon than East Anglia. And of course, the term East Anglia, which is the term we use to this day, comes from the Angles. So you tend to get a lot of clues as to Britain's history from the names of places. And if you know what to look out for, a name tells an awful lot about a place. But we'll certainly be getting onto that later. But yes, the Danes settled East Anglia all the way up towards sort of Durham way, and then eventually they stop up sort of Scotland way. But yes, and then you've got more Celts in Wales, which of course, as we covered before, was the Anglo-Saxon name for foreigner. And around sort of this Viking period, Devon and Cornwall, down in the southwest, my neck of the woods where I grew up, became vassal states or direct parts of Wessex, which was an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. But I'm not going to get too much into the history, and I'm sure Bo in Epochs has something far more of a deep dive into that if you're interested. It might be a good complement to this. But because, of course, the Vikings were largely Danish, their language was largely mutually intelligible to the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes that had settled in England, because back in their point of origin, they would have more or less been neighbours. And so it makes sense that there's a lot of overlap there. And it wouldn't necessarily be the same as, say, American English and, English, or Australian English and American English, or vice versa. You get the idea. It's not like that where, there's a slight accent. There are differences in words and things like that. But there's more of a shared history than, say, modern day English and, I don't know, modern Italian. In fact, there's a big deviation there. But of course, there's still some shared points of origin. There's some shared overlap. You can kind of understand some words. Perhaps a more accurate example would be modern French and modern English, although the Normans come in and make that a bit more complicated of a comparison. But in the lands that they conquered, this is the Vikings, of course, they did live alongside the Anglo-Saxon speakers. And, once they'd conquered the lands, they weren't necessarily interested in, murdering, killing them. It wasn't necessarily useful for them. They wanted people to, run farms, and having a larger population to do that was helpful. And so they did coexist with one another. I don't know how civilly that was, but we're not necessarily, again, going into the history. This is just language. But a form of bilingualism likely developed. Of course, this is speculation, but it seems to be the case from linguistic analysis that this happened. And this is important for multiple reasons. This may explain, for example, why there's seemingly a grammatical influence of Old Norse rather than it just being loan words, because you find when there's slight contact, they were here for about 100 years, you get lots of loan words, but not necessarily changes to grammar. When there are changes to grammar, it means that there may well have been people who were primarily either Old Norse speakers or Old English speakers that learnt the opposite language, and they brought their grammatical approach from their native tongue to this new language, and then there's this sort of interference whereby the standards, the grammatical standards that is, change slowly as lots of people participate in this bilingualism. But of the words that have either a Germanic or Old Norse origin, 50% of those words have cognates, meaning they've got equivalents in both languages. 36% of them are only found in Old English, and 14% of them in Old Norse. So it still seems like Old English was the dominant force in Britain, which makes sense because there were more Anglo-Saxons than there were Norsemen or Northmen or Danes, whatever you want to call them. But there are only about 150 loan words, but there are some very important ones here. I'm just going to read some of them for you. So, egg, steak, meaning this actually comes from the word to fry. Knife, and the K was pronounced in Old Norse, so it would be knife or knif, which is more accurate to the Old Norse. The word bylaw, meaning village law, which it still means to this day. Die, as in, to kill someone. Anger, hit, take. You can see why these words entered the vocabulary, considering what they did. Ugly, leg, skin, bread, which I thought was an interesting one, because you would imagine bread would have been in the language already. We also mentioned the word, of course, bannock, which is a Celtic word for a specific type of bread, or at least in the modern day it is. Bag, ball, down, fog, muck, rotten, lump, scrawny, bark, root, sky. As in, where are you? And we mentioned these cognates previously. Words Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday are quite often attributed to Norse gods Tyr or Tyre, Odin, and Freya, respectively. But it seems like they may well have been named after the Anglo-Saxon equivalents of these gods. This is, of course, before they converted to Christianity, so it would be Germanic paganism, which, of course, has overlaps with Old Norse because, obviously, they're geographically quite close. So Tyr, Wodan, and Frigga, or Frigga, depending on how you pronounce it, of course, doesn't really matter anymore. No one pronounces it like they used to, but these are obviously similar to one another, and so to attribute it to one or the other is a little bit pedantic, but it seems like it may well have been the Anglo-Saxons, and it's just that the Old Norse didn't interfere because they were so similar. So it makes sense that these days of the week are as they are. But it's interesting that our days of the week are pagan. I didn't necessarily know that until researching recently. It's also worth mentioning, as I mentioned in the previous part, that place names are a goldmine for linguistic history because they don't nearly change as much as other things. Place name doesn't necessarily have to correspond to your spoken language as much because it's sort of very idiosyncratic to a place and time. But town names ending with by, which is the Old Norse for town, so places like Grimsby means Grim's town. So there's a bloke called Grim, presumably a Viking, who had a town, and that's where the name comes from. So Thornby, probably a bloke named Thorn, or Crosby, a bloke named Cros, owned this town, and that's where it comes from. Not particularly imaginative, seemingly, because it's just me town. You could have thought that, at least when the Americans started naming towns, they named it after landmarks rather than themselves, although you've got Jamestown. I'm not sure if that's named after a person or not, but still. You also you can thank the Old Norse for they, them, and their pronouns. They introduced those, of course, not in the non-binary sense. It's more just you're referring to a group of people, as normal people used to use those pronouns only about 10 years ago. So don't listen to the claims of, Vikings were transgender, they didn't have as much of a gender binary. Nonsense. They were manly men, right? I don't think that if your knowledge of that throughout all human cultures in modernity is anything to go by, they're not going to be all wishy-washy and gender bending, are they? Come on. But yes, that's where this comes from. There wasn't necessarily this distinction in Old English.
Thank you for watching that clip from my series Contemplations. If you want to sign up to the website for £5 a month, you can access that series, which comes out 1 p.m. every Saturday. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.